Okay, so now what is important for the fruit? If we slice the period of leaf area development into two subsections, we really are looking at what's happening between 0 growing degree days and 1,000 growing degree days, where typically for Cabernet Sauvignon, veraison starts to kick in. So what we did was taking a look at the literature, and wherever the work comes from, it's always reported that shoot elongation is extremely fast. Therefore, it's easy to look at differences between situations between 0 and 400 growing degree days. That's when the high speed of shoot elongation rate is being monitored. So we are going to look at that, and we are also going to, once the leaf area growth has been established, look at how actively nitrogen can be taken up. But before we are doing that, since the fuel that drives up the speed at which leaf elongates, we need to look at thermal time, which is really the driver of the speed of shoot elongation. And so what we did here was actually looking not only at one weather station, but at all the weather stations we are monitoring across Napa Valley to get a sense of not only the footprint of the vintage, but whether or not different vintages were exacerbating differences between low heat accumulation sites in one hand and high heat accumulation sites in the other hand. But the conclusion is that, in fact, we see that 2016, during most of the leaf area growth, here I have stretched it up until June 21st because it's the solstice, but you see it's basically the same picture. The cooler sites in the southern end of Napa are slightly cooler in 16 than 15 and 14, and the warmest sites are very similar to 2015. What is really to take away from this slide is the span of variations between the coolest and the warmest site. Sometimes within 1 year, we observe the same variability between the coolest and warmest site that we can observe at the same site across different years. So it's interesting to get clear in your mind that sometimes we can substitute what we observe spatially for things that we are going to observe either in the past or in the future. If we look at the spring rain amount, as I was saying earlier, not only did we start the season with the root reservoir full of water, but on top of that, during this critical period of quick leaf area development rate, we had a very high extra supply of water. So what does that mean? It means that probably the speed at which should have elongated in 2016 will be fast. The last index we are going to look before we look at the plant physiological responses is the dryness index. The dryness index is very raw. It's simply a way to look simultaneously at the vapor pressure deficit, the wind speed, the light available in terms of how much drought it induces in the plant, here computed as the ET of references, versus rain. So rain is the supply, ETRF is the demand. And by looking over specific periods at the lack of balance or the right balance between those supply and demand, we get an easy picture. And the highest is the dryness index, the earlier and the more severe is the drought that's being perceived by the plant. And compared to 14 and to 15, again, we have those quantifiable parameters that screams that there was no dryness during the leaf area growth. So now we start to really nail down why leaf area was so exuberant in 2016. But before we dive a bit more into results, let's keep things in perspective. Growing degree day wise, total heat accumulation is similar to 2015, but it was also accompanied with a steady and high water supply plus a low drought index. So the fact that we have a low drought index threw us a little bit out of balance, because if we weren't having a low drought index, for sure we would have had the fastest growth rate. But the fact that there was a low drought index, that maybe light was a bit limiting or maybe temperature were a bit limiting, couldn't help predicting what was going to be observed in 2016 beforehand. So therefore, two question marks. yes or no, faster growth rate. And the corollary, the next question will be yes or no, higher nitrogen uptake, because we have reason to believe that more nitrogen will be available, but is this nitrogen actually being uptaken by the plant? We can't know. If the plant grows quickly, maybe there is not enough nitrogen, and this nitrogen gets diluted into more biomass. So data helps us understanding that. And why, from a winemaker and vineyard manager, is it critical to understand that? Because it has some direct impact on your practices. In a year where we suspect a low water deficit, maybe we could help a little bit the water deficit to kick in earlier, specifically in sites that have a deeper rooting system. Questions such as, should we exceptionally delay the mowing of our cover crop? Should we delay the hedging so that we lose a little bit more water through transpiration? Should we leave more laterals because we know that laterals have proportionally a higher contribution at increasing the crop coefficient, that is the amount of light harvested by the plants to fuel the pump that will transpire water? All those questions will be helped by those considerations. And then nitrogen-wise, what is the moment in time when the peak of nitrogen is actually taken up by the plant? And how should that affect your fertilization program? Should you spray? Should you not spray? So the long story short, after we pulled out thousands of data points, we actually draw lines through those clouds, those potatoes of data, to get the trends that tells us whether or not the shoot growth rate was in fact the fastest we've observed. And yes, indeed, whether you look at Cabernet Sauvignon or Shiraz, the speed at which should have elongated went for Cabernet Sauvignon in 2014 from 13 millimeter per growing degree day per square meter, up to 22. So you see we had almost 100% increase in the speed with which leaf area growth rate has really crept up this year. And of course, Shiraz had a slightly higher growth rate, but the distribution of those speeds 2014, 2015, and 2016 gave us always the same picture. So yes, actually, the high water supply won the game and made it for a faster shoot elongation rate, even if there was a slightly lower drought index. Actually, Cabernet Sauvignon had the fastest increase in growth rate, then Shiraz, then Merlot. So why is that important? Why are we even spending time on that, since at the end of the day what matters is maturation? Well, it's because growth rate is a proxy for early stress. So if we start to see that the growth rate slows down before 400 growing degree days, we can take immediate decision regarding irrigation that are going to speed up a little bit the leaf area architecture. And that has carryover effect on flavonoid composition, since modulating water deficit early season has been reported, and we'll discuss that a bit more later, as an enhancer of fruit flavonoid composition. At the same time, it also reduces peak berry weight, which may or may not be a result you are looking after. However, if early season water deficit is too severe, we have a poorer leaf area development with a poorer nutrient uptake, which is going to jeopardize next year yield. So at this point in time, the only parameters that could be limiting growth rate during the phase of rapid shoot elongation, here going from March 1st to the solstice, June 21st, you see that there was no limitation in heat accumulation. So what is the last limiting factor at this point? That's what we're going to discuss in a minute. But to keep everyone on track, right now, the second take-home message of the 2016 is that there was zero early water deficit. Shoot elongation was mainly driven by heat accumulation, since water wasn't the issue, unless nitrogen was a limiting factor. So when is it most pertinent to look at nitrogen? Well, nitrogen uptake is a very energy-active, energy-demanding process. So that's why the plant needs enough leaf area to invest the energy under the shape of ATP to actively take the nitrogen that's out of its system into its system. So that's why it's only after you have a specific amount of leaf area development that the plant has enough chemistry, molecular energy stored under the chemical energy of ATP to actually feed the active supply of nitrogen at the root interface and then distribute it into the leaf area. So that's why we start looking at nitrogen after 400 growing degree days. And what are we suspecting? Well, we are suspecting to see a trend where nitrogen first rises, peaks, and maybe decline. So it's going to be very important to understand how the seasonal traits are modulating the timing when those peaks, those bursts of nitrogen uptake are being observed. And we expect those bursts of nitrogen uptake to happen anywhere between 400 and 1,000 growing degree days. Why is it important? Again, trying to connect that with the fruit, because quantity and quality are directly impacted by nitrogen. First of all, we all remember the low yield in 2015. Tim was mentioning that we had low temperature during bloom. That's true, that did have some impact, but really the hidden part of the iceberg was coming from the fact that 2015 was coming out of a 2014 vintage where we had no water during the winter, which meant that by the time the plant was ready to have this rapid active flush of nitrogen, well, the nitrogen had not been mineralized. And that's going to be very interesting to see later today how the experts in microbiology can shed some light on that aspect. So 2014, very poor nitrogen uptake, which directly and negatively affected the potential for yield in 2015. So that's a very clear relationship we can draw from one year to the next. But then not only the quantity but also the intrinsic quality of skin composition will be affected, and flavor particularly will be affected by the supply of nitrogen. Just to quote one work, the work from Souberan, but you could quote the work from Hilbert as well. Those authors have compared at different timing throughout the maturation process how the carryover effect of a poor or a high nitrogen uptake early season was actually boosting or declining the amount of anthocyanins or the amount of flavors. So we know from a winemaker standpoint, between 400 and 1,000 growing degree days, we would like to have some moderate nitrogen if quality is what we have in mind. And on the other side of the spectrum, 2 years ago, Mendes Costabel presented here his work on rain mitigation during the winter, and he showed that actually having too much nitrogen or too much rain during the winter could boost the expression of green aromas, such as methoxypyrazine, way later in the season, like in August or in September. So for those reasons, it's very important to look at nitrogen. So what's the typical tendency? So here we made some very interesting finding, because instead of using the destructive approach of nitrogen, we are actually using a new techniques that's based on fluorescence. Fluorescence simply leverages the fact that when plant tissues are exposed to high and specific wavelength, chlorophyll gets excited. So the electrons gravitating around the molecules shift from one orbital level to a higher energy orbital level. And then they excite themselves, go back to their more steady orbital, but in doing that, they emit a photon. So this photon is actually emitted from within the plant tissue. This is the process of fluorescence. So what we are looking at is how this light that's emitted from within the plant tissue, from the inside to the outside, is actually being screened off by other plant compounds, such as flavonols or chlorophyll or nitrogen. So here what you're looking at is how, after excitation, the leaves are actually telling us how much nitrogen is actually in the way when light travels back from the inside to the outside. And this is very important because it tells us two things. It tells us when nitrogen accumulation peaks, so here typically around 700 growing degree days. So you see, after the speed of maximal shoot elongation is reached, we still wait 300 growing degree days to see that peak. That's a typical profile. Each profile is site-specific, obviously. And also, the value of this peak. Maybe at some point in the dilemma between getting enough access to water and getting that water rich enough in nutrients, sometimes you don't have enough nutrients to enrich the concentration if the nitrogen that's going to flow from the roots to the leaf. So that's why this peak value here at 12 sometimes varies, sometimes it's below 10, sometimes it's above 20. So you see we get two information from looking at this signal. It tells us how quickly and how efficient is the plant at pumping nitrogen to then distribute it into the canopy, and what is the value of this peak nitrogen. So how do you link this new way, innovative way of looking at nitrogen content with what is traditionally done? Well, you just look at the literature. In 2015, Serovich, building on top of other work, actually published those results where you see on your x-axis the classical special analysis methods where we get the dry extract of nitrogen and then we classically distribute those nitrogen levels from red low to green high according to an amount in milligrams per gram of nitrogen extract. Well, there is a very nice relationship between what you can obtain destructively here on your x-axis and what you can obtain non-destructively on your y-axis. And you see that the 12 peak value that I had illustrated earlier matches more or less what we see in the moderate level of nitrogen uptake. So because we had many reference sites across Napa, we were able actually to project in the context of 2016 where those peak value were actually observed. And that's where they were in 2016. So that is nice because we have now a clear understanding that in spite of having had a lot of water, the nutrient content of the plant was not negatively affected by the dilution effect. It's often the fear of vineyard managers under arid conditions. When we have a very wet springs, there is not enough nitrogen in the ground. So you end up with exuberant leaf area development, but a poorer nutrient level. So it wasn't obvious to have this relatively moderate to high level of nitrogen uptake, but I believe it's really the footprint of having had a steady rain regime in 2016 that helped boosting the microbiological activity, therefore making plant nutrients more available. So as a take-home, the peak absorption that we've observed were distributed anywhere from 9 to 20, and they were all reached between 400 and 1,000 growing degree days, with most of the peak reached around 700 growing degree days. So that's what I summarized here. The take-home, that's a good news for this coming year, because since we had last year, on average, a high nitrogen uptake, we should expect, provided that the climatic conditions around bloom are favorable, to have a high yield potential. The question is, what's going to be the impact on color? In 2016, since we don't have the benefit necessarily of a moderate supply of nitrogen, maybe it's going to lower a little bit the color potential. Practical decisions attached to this analysis. Too much nitrogen, maybe for next year, or for the pruning decision, if it hasn't been done yet, you could increase the number of points in order to spread more evenly this extra burst of nitrogen availability. And if you don't have enough nitrogen, knowing that the peak of nitrogen sometimes is reached before 700, tells you that your spray should be done before 700, right when the plant is most actively sucking and absorbing nutrients. So maybe it will help you optimize your fertilization practice by avoiding spraying maybe around 1,000 growing degree days, when by then the plant is not actively absorbing. So even if we are in a low water deficit year, still we know every year there are sites where water deficit is apparent. How much should we worry in the context of a greater drought? How should we be in tune and updated with the latest research in terms of drought? So we invited Sylvain Delzon because he did some major work on understanding cavitation, because that's really what drought why drought is bad. When drought is really severe, it induces cavitation, so the presence of air bubble inside the vessels, making the vessels no longer functional. So the talk of Sylvain will focus on how much water stress a vine can sustain. Unfortunately, Sylvain could not make it. He was coming from Bordeaux, and we are very sorry for that. So I'm going to try my best to present on his behalf. Since he's in France, we could not even have him on real time here. So I'm going to do my best. I am asking you to apologize he's not being able to attend. But here is the story that Sylvain was going to share with us. And I think it's a pretty compelling story, so I'm pretty excited to do it. Of course, I'm not going to do as good of a job as he would have, but that's the way it is. Vulnerability to embolism. Embolism is what we have when we have some heart attack, when all of a sudden the flow of blood can no longer circulate. Well, that happens when we are looking at plant mortality. It's often caused by embolism. Every time we apply water, we are still unclear whether or not we are helping the process of embolism or not. Many people think that the plant cavitates daily. You will see that this conception can be shaken and completely reconsidered. So that's why the title is Do We Need a Miracle? So right now the lack of consensus is about, is cavitation happening? Are the plants full of air at some point during the day, every day? Yes, no? How do they refill their vessels? Another particular thing about vine is that vessels in the vines are very long. They are anywhere from 80 to 100 centimeters. It's a particularity compared to conifers, for instance. So that makes the study of xylem vessels very hard because sensitive to measurements. Every time you look at a shoot section, you may only look at a subsection of the whole vessels. So the simple fact of measuring creates artifact because you are actually looking at only a portion of the vessels. So that's why there has been an interest on developing new techniques. And let's take a step back here. In the past, it used to be that the vine was the model plant. So we knew proportionally much more about vine in the 17th century than we do today. Today, vine is not actually at the forefront of what we understand very well. Hopefully it's going to change, but Robert Hooke was one of the first scientists making observation with his microscope, and he came up with the first view of how those xylem vessels work. They carry sap. They are full of sap, they are full of liquid, and that was his observation because they were dark under his microscope. That was the consensus up until Nehemiah grew, right around the same epoch, said, no, that's not true. Actually, this is not the way the plant tissue are actually used by the plant. The plants are full of air. So he completely negated what his colleague had said, and he based his work on those stem sections. And according to him, it's important to note that he was doing those stem sections at midday. So actually, by the time he was sectioning the plant, he was actually inducing the cavitation. And his explanation as far as, well, how sap goes up to the leaves, well, the sap is just pushed on the bark and it travels along the phloem, but the center of the plant is full of air. So, black holes. And then Dixon. So Dixon is a genius, an American that in 1914 came up with this very brilliant theory that revolutionized plant world. He came up without any experimental proof with this explanation that what makes the water column go up is simply due to the fact that there are molecular forces between water molecules that induces a cohesion between along the water column. Even when the water column is under tension, it's thanks to this cohesion that actually the water is able to rise. So he came up with this theory called tension cohesion, which actually was very revolutionary at the time, since it implies that water moves under negative pressure. That's for the tension, and then the cohesion is what brings the rise of the sap. What's amazing about that is that he did that without any proof. We had to wait until 1960 for Scholander, you know, the Scholander water pressure bomb that we use today, that's him, to actually get the proof that yes, water pressure inside the plant is negative. So, tension cohesion, that's 1914. And then, new controversy, 97. Can he say, no. Actually, there is no cohesion. The plant is part of the day full of air. Look at my data. So it took here a section of, I think it's ash. And you see that immediately after having taken his stem section, he freezes it in nitrogen. And sure, in the morning, the vessels are full of water. And what you see in the center of the morning stem section is the water that has frozen. But then he makes a section at noon while the water is under tension, and there is nothing to freeze because the mere fact of sectioning the plant actually creates the apparition of cavitation. And he concluded that, yeah, the plant is full of air. We had to wait 2000 when Scholasch demonstrated that it was actually a measurement artifact. So the science of cavitation is really bubbling right now. 2000, that's really when we started to invalidate this assumption from Cani that was saying that actually the cohesion tension theory was not true. Well, now we think it's true. And actually, we are now at the dawn of a new era to investigate through the use of X-ray how water is actually traveling into the plant. So here I'd like to take a minute to explain why so many research are now done with the help of synchrotron. So synchrotron is a very expensive measurement tool, but it's unique because it tells us non-destructively in real time under the whole plant without doing any section how water is actually distributed within the plant tissue. So what you see here is two stem sections of oak, and you look at it through X-ray. You see a stem section of oak under 10 bar, so that's the middle picture, and you see that most of the picture is in the grayish tone. The black dots are actually dots where you see air bubble. And you see that you have to wait until you reach minus 60 bars to see actually a more significant presence of air bubbles. So that's cavitation. So that's how we can study vineyard resilience to cavitation. So what Sylvain did with his team, he basically came up with the graph that you can see in the center. So he was building on top of work published by the Australian Scholasch, who was actually looking at the speed with which air bubble disseminates along the vessels. But let's spend some time on the center graph. What you can see on your x-axis going from your right to your left is an increasing water pressure. So you go from 0 on your right to minus 60 bars on your left. So as you go from your right to your left, the water potential inside the plant gets more and more negative. And you see how transpiration, which is the green light, declines as a consequence of the tension increasing in the sap. And what you see in red is when cavitation starts to occur. So you see that what's very blatant here is that it's only after transpiration has stopped that cavitation occurs. In order to quantify this, we look actually in the red line at the percentage of vessels that have embolism. So if you look, do I have a pointer? Yes. Here, you have 50% of the vessels that have embolism. Here you have 10% of the vessels that have embolism. Here you have 90% of the vessels that have embolism. That is plant mortality. Something that's unique about vines is that they recover from cavitation. Not all the tree species are doing that. But you can have cavitation, so that means that all the aerial part of your plant will die, but next year it will grow again. But when we study mortality, we look at P90, when 90% of the vessels have air bubble in it, and only 10% of the xylem is functional, and P50. So I'm going to use P50, the pressure at which 50% of the vessels are no longer working, as my reference to compare varietals and to compare rootstocks. However, the controversy keeps going. Here you have results coming from California in 2012, where the picture that the scientists Jacobsen and Pratt have described is extremely worrisome. Why? Because they show you that as stomate closes, already as early as -3 bar, we've reached cavitation. So that means that as soon as the stomates open, poof, there is a drop in water tension that creates the apparition of air bubbles. So it is extremely worrisome for the industry, because if this is true, that means that the plant cavitates all the time. Because at -3 bars, very few vineyards function at -3 bars. We are all looking. Actually, that's what Sylvain has reported here. So you see the range at which water potential operates within the plant. So 25 years of data coming from Cheval Blanc, and all the data that are from California have been merged together. And you see that over 25 years, on average, the water potential at which the plant functions is anywhere between -15 bar and -20 bars. So according to the graph on your left, the plant functions under cavitation all the time, but at levels of water potential that should induce the death of the plant. We are at -12. You see, we are at P90. So 90% of the vessels, according to those works, are embolized. So are we completely missing the boat, or is there something that we are not understanding? That's what at the root of the work of Sylvain Delzon team. Are we wrong about our understanding? So assuming that Jacobsen and Pratt are right, what can we make to understand vine vulnerability to embolism? And how come that embolism seems to be magically repaired at the end of every day? So how can we use X-ray to shed some light on that? So here we have to salute the pioneering work of Brodersen. So those researchers are from here, actually, California, Berkeley, and Davis. And here what you're seeing are stem section of vines. You're seeing on your top left a vine that is under -17 bars. And stress goes gradually up until -40 bars on your bottom right. And what you're seeing gradually, as more and more water tension is taking place into the stem section, you see that gradually air bubbles form from the center to the periphery, and you have to reach -40 bars to get 50% of embolism. So a very different picture than the one painted earlier. Okay, so that's what Brodersen showed. Not only did he show how embolism spread throughout the stem section, but he also came up with the air seeding theory. It's not that air bubbles spontaneously appear at many, many different locations. It's actually the presence of one single air bubble that propagates through punctuation, and that makes embolism going gradually to many, many different vessels, while this air bubble gets his way through the punctuation of the vessels. Okay, so very interesting work. But what Sylvain Delzon team has started to wonder is how quickly those cavitation symptoms unfold. In order to answer that question, they actually subjected the plant to gradual cycle of dehydration, rehydration in the first hand. So that's the first interesting result. You can see here that when we reach minus 10 bar, only 9% of the vessels have embolism. In order to reach the P50, that is the loss of conductivity induced by 50% of xylem full of air, we have to go down here to minus 17 bars. Those are in potted plants. So that means that in outdoor condition, it's maybe even lower than that, but we'll see later. So minus 20 bar, 50% of cavitation, minus 10 bar, 10% of cavitation. Vine is more resistant to drought than previously thought. The second very important finding by looking at conductivity during a drying cycle is that there is a very strong disconnect between the stem and the petiole. The fact that actually you can see at minus 10 bar here that at the petiole level we are around 30% of loss of conductivity while there is nothing still at the stem, means that there is a disconnect between the stem and the shoot. This is called segmentation, hydraulic segmentation, and it's a feature of the vine. That means that the vine is actually blocking and compartmentalizing the water tissue content according to the position of the organ. What does it mean for us? This is simply why midday leaf water potential can get very low, very, very low, without telling you anything about soil moisture. So what you see at the root level is not connected with what you see at the leaf level. So that's why there is a lot of water savings that can be done by looking at the plant as a whole, as opposed to looking at water potential. You can have a positive water potential at the root level of plus 1 bar, while you are monitoring minus 10 bars at the leaf level. In order to go further, what Delzon team has done, in order to keep the integrity of the xylem vessels while creating faster some stresses, they introduce within this 1 meter tube a whole shoot. And then they spin it. And while spinning it, water goes on the outside. And as water goes on the outside, it stretches the xylem tension inside the vessels. And we can look when embolism occurs. So that's a way to quickly get what we call cavitation curves. Hundreds of samplings can be done, and we compare susceptibility to cavitation between rootstocks and varietals. So what are we looking at here? Here we are looking at results. Let's just focus on 110 first. So here you see the rootstock. As you go from your right to your left, water potential gets more and more negative. And you see that the P50 here is reached at this point, and on another run, you see that it is run at this point. What is the difference between those two measurements? It's just time. You see that on a rootstock, in July, the susceptibility to cavitation happens around minus 27 bars, whereas in September, in the rootstock, the susceptibility to cavitation happens around minus 35 bars. So this is called an ontogenic effect. That means that as the plant ages, it becomes more and more resilient to drought. That is true for a rootstock. It's also true for a varietal. Here you can see for the Shiraz. The Shiraz gets a P50 early season in July around minus 20 bars. And then in September, it's around minus 30 bar. And then it's around minus 40 bar in October. So as the plant lignifies, it becomes less and less susceptible to cavitation. Good news for us. That means that the plants are way more resilient to drought than we thought, and that there is this ontogenic effect. So you see the range of water potential at which we operate when we are under danger is anywhere between minus 17 and minus 30 bars. Not only that, but also very interesting, rootstock have a much greater resistance than varietals. You see that Vitis vinifera, first of all, you see that it's very difficult to discriminate between different varietals. All the P50 here, the 50% of xylem embolism are all together around minus 25 bars, whereas for rootstock, you see there is almost 10 bars of differences. So it is important because rootstocks are therefore way more resistant to cavitation, therefore to drought, since we are around 32 bars for a P50 instead of 27 bars. And second take-home, there is no obvious differences between varietals in terms of vulnerability to cavitation. Last, effect of irrigation. What happens during a cycle of dry down water? Well, what the authors have done here, they have let potted vines drying, massive irrigation, and then they looked at how quickly post-embolism those vessels were refilling. It's very important because today you have a lot of people that still think that the vessels are full of air every day and that the refilling occurs at night. This is actually not true. What those researchers have found is that the refilling post-cavitation, so you see they went down to P50, where 50% of the red dots here are vessels filled with air, and the blue dots are vessels filled with water. You see that once the P50 has been reached, we have to wait and wait and wait until water pressure gets again positive. There is no magic refilling of the xylem with water once embolism have occurred. So it is bad because that means that we need to wait. It's not easy to repair from cavitation. It's not such a bad news because cavitation is a little bit like you having 106 Fahrenheit of body temperature. It occurs very rarely. However, it's critical to make sure you never reach that high body temperature level. That's the same with cavitation. It's a rare event, but when it occurs, there is no magic recovery. So that closes the discussion because you see that 340 years after the first finding of GRU, we are back to his initial hypothesis. Yes, the plant is full of water unless extraordinary condition occurs. Here, that was just a simple drawing. Here, it's an X-ray picture. But I think we get 5 take-home from Sylvain work. First, vine is very resistant to embolism. There is no differences in terms of susceptibility to cavitation across varietals. There is no daily embolism. Vine is not able to repair embolism under tension. And there is a strong hydraulic segmentation that explains to us why we need to look at the whole plant as opposed to the leaf. So, of course, Sylvain wanted me to thank all the team that participated. So it's not only a French team, there is actually Greg Gambetta that is in the team. A team of also Shoat and his workers from Australia, and the rest of the French people are there. So there is a lot of papers that are going to be published over the coming months. It's obviously a very interesting topic. I think we are going to learn a lot and maybe shake a little bit our ideas on how to better optimize water distribution in the vineyard. So I don't know if we have time for a few questions. Obviously, I may not be able to answer all of them. But just before the coffee break, then, if there is no question, I'm going to close up with the take-home number 4, which is that the plant is built to resist drought, that compared to the previous year's fruit composition in 2016 shouldn't be expected to bear the footprint of water deficit, and that the consequences that we are expecting and that we are going to explore after the break will be that since low water deficit has been observed, we should observe a higher berry weight, a delayed loading of sugar, and a delayed loading of color into the skin with carryover effect on the sensorial properties of tannins. So the coffee break is now. Mark, up until what time do we have the coffee break?
About a 10-minute break.
We have a 10-minute break, so thank you, and we'll resume in a minute.